In this section of the module, we will look at prospect theory and framing effects. Prospect theory is a very influential theory of decision-making under uncertainty. It describes when people will be risk-seeking and when they will be risk-averse. Under prospect theory, intuitive judgments are influenced by two key concepts: reference dependence and loss aversion. Another key aspect of the theory is that the way people subjectively frame an outcome in their minds affects their actions. Before we get to defining these things, let's look at a couple examples of problems. Here's problem one. Would you accept this gamble? The gamble is you have a 50% chance to win $150, 50% chance to lose $100. Okay, would you take this? Well, rational utility theory would say that you should accept the gamble. The expected utility is positive. In the long run, you have better chances of gain than loss. $50 is expected utility, in fact. Yet most people decline. This shows the tendency of most of us to be risk averse. The pain of losing $100 outweighs the gain of $150. Obviously, there are individual differences, and some of you would accept this gamble, but most people would not. Here's problem two. Which would you choose? You have to choose one of these two situations, events. Would you choose to win $100 with certainty, or would you take a 50% chance to win $200, 50% chance to win nothing? This is sort of the classic old, gambles on game shows. They would say, okay, here's $100, you can keep it, or you can go for double or nothing. Okay, so you take $100, or would you risk it at a 50% chance to get $200, at 50% chance of getting nothing? Problem three. Would you choose to lose $100 of certainty, or would you take a 50% chance to lose nothing and a 50% chance to lose $200? Okay, so this is also sort of the classic gambling situation where you lost. Would you double down? Okay, double or nothing. Okay. All right, so think about which of those options you would choose in both problems 2 and 3. All right, the vast majority of people in both problem sets choose the sure gain in problem 2 and the sure, but avoid the sure loss in problem 3. Okay, but for both problem sets, the choices have the same expected utilities. In problem set 2, the expected utility is $100. In problem 3, the expected utility is negative $100. But people respond much differently because of the frame of reference. Okay, so again, they respond differently. In problem 2, they go with the sure gain. In problem 3, they go with the riskier option, as indicated by the red asterisks here. So when faced with the gain, people are risk averse. They go with a sure gain rather than a risky gain. And when faced with a loss, people are risk seeking. They go with a risky loss over the sure loss. In your assigned reading, Bruce Neer reviews these differences in risk seeking and risk aversion and makes the point that these tendencies reflect good survival strategies. We accept small gains rather than risking them for larger ones, and risk larger losses rather than accepting smaller losses. These strategies make sense because they're more likely to keep food and resources on hand. All right. Prospect theory has an important value function that it proposes, and it captures both the notions of reference dependence and risk aversion. Okay, and it shows how we are sensitive to changes or differences in states of well-being. So this graph here, I'm going to keep showing, but it's important to understand because it's going to capture both the notions of reference dependence, be a reference point, okay, and it's also going to explain why we tend to be risk averse, and it's also going to show that we are especially sensitive to changes or differences as opposed to absolute values, changes or differences in our well-being. Okay, the value function graphs the value of the outcome relative to a reference point. Once again, here's a reference point, and here's the value. Greater value going up on the vertical axis. Outcomes to the right of the reference point are seen as gains. Outcomes to the left of the reference point are seen as losses. Okay. So think about winning $100 is a gain relative to the reference point. Losing $100 is a loss relative to the reference point. And often, as we'll find, the reference point we tend to adopt tends to be the status quo. Okay, our current financial situation. We gain $100 or lose $100 from the current status quo. Um, um, the vertical axis again captures the value of the outcome. The value at the reference point is neutral. Okay, so gains associated with positive value. Gains are associated with positive value, and losses are associated with negative value. Note the S-shaped curve. Okay, it's convex below the reference point and concave above it. This means that we are maximally sensitive to change nearest the reference point. Okay, the steepness of the curves you can see is greater near the reference point. The asymptote of the curve implies that the joy of gains diminishes with the size of the gain. There's sort of a point of diminishing returns. So, for example, the difference between a $10,000 bonus and a $1,000 bonus is substantial, but the difference between a $110,000 and a $101,000 bonus is not as substantial. And the pain of losses diminishes with size also. Losing $1,000 relative to zero is substantial, but losing $101,000 relative to $100,000 is not as substantial. Okay. Also note that the curve is steeper in the domain of losses, steeper here, than in the domain of gains. So the pain of losses is greater than the corresponding joy of gains. That's going to be important when we explain risk aversion. Okay, so just another way of showing this, if you're still trying to understand the graph, think about the pain associated with the loss of $50 is greater than the magnitude of joy associated with a gain of $50. If you somehow had $50 in your pocket and got home and found out that it was gone, the pain that you experience would probably be greater than the joy that you might experience if you're walking down the street and you find $50 on the street. The same would hold for larger amounts, although the change in value in both directions reaches an asymptote at some point. Okay, so I mentioned also before that framing, how we frame things subjectively in our mind, influences our choices and our actions. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of framing effects. These were also covered in your readings, but it'd be useful to go over them here. Imagine you are responsible for making health policy in the face of a major flu epidemic that is expected to kill 600 people. You have to choose between two options. Policy A will save 200 lives. Policy B has a 1/3 chance of saving 600 lives and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Which policy would you choose? Okay, take a second and what should you choose, A or B? Okay, 72% of people choose policy A. Again, most of you, I would say that three quarters of you probably chose A. Some of you chose B, but the majority would choose A. Okay, now imagine the same scenario. Flu epidemic is expected to kill 600 people. And the following two policies. Policy A will cause 400 people to die. Policy B has a 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. Which policy would you choose? Well, now 78%, again roughly three quarters, people choose policy B. Okay? But these same, it's interesting to look at this because these scenarios have the same expected utility. Okay? The discrepancy in the results can only be attributed to the framing effects. And the fact that you frame something as a saving lives versus losing lives, we become, again, sort of riskier in scenario 2 because things are framed as losses. A little risk averse in scenario 1 because they're framed as gains. That's a classic example that Kahneman and Tversky use to demonstrate framing effects. Your readings give a couple other examples as well. Okay. All right. An important feature of prospect theory is its emphasis on short-term outcomes rather than long-term outcomes. Long-term outcomes are favored by a rational utility model of decision-making. Prospect theory focuses instead on how we experience change from the reference point, and that change is experienced as emotions, and that emotions is a short-term outcome. Okay, so it's an emphasis on the fact that we react strongly to change, and can change defined as a movement from the reference point either in a positive or negative direction. All right, this recognizes that people react emotionally to changes or differences, and that these are important outcomes. And that Kahneman and Tversky argue that these short-term outcomes have strong effects on our thought processes and dominate them. Okay, remember we already talked about earlier in the semester, the power of short-term outcomes for us. As an example, this thing about the immediate frustration associated with following safety procedures. Okay, it's like, oh, I got to do this. It usually means that it takes longer time to do it than we're used to, and again, that's a short-term emotion that we experience, but also influences our decisions. So think about implications for change then. Okay, especially in organizations. The status quo, the current policy, can be seen as a reference point. All right, the resistance to change can be explained by the fact that for most people, the disadvantages of change loom larger than the advantages of change. Okay, so just think about, I've sort of graphed here is that, sort of equal gain versus equal loss, the reference, the value associated with the possible losses is much greater. The height of this change here on the axis is greater than the change here in value associated with the gains. So this is your classic resistance to organizational change. This sort of the pain of potential inconvenience. The change in how we do things is inconvenient to change, or potential increased workload that people see is greater than the joy of the potential security or productivity that comes with the change. Okay, there's also some implications for warnings. Excuse me. That should be if people have a disproportionate aversion to losses relative to the appreciation of gains, then what would be a more effective strategy for reducing careless internet behavior? Okay. Should we emphasize the losses due to irresponsible behavior, potential losses in terms of damage to the computer, financial losses due to accounts being raided, inconvenience associated with getting viruses or being hacked? Should we emphasize the losses, or should we emphasize the gains from being responsible? Many policies emphasize the gains. This is what you get from being responsible and following the policy. Prospect theory would argue that you would be much more effective if you emphasize the losses due to the irresponsible behavior. Okay, so that's a quick review of prospect theory. Next presentation sort of wraps up our first two presentations that have looked at sort of heuristics and prospect theory, and looks at some summaries about risk perceptions and how we respond to risk.